we have all been concerned as well by the Russian-Ukraine invasion and its impact even on Ghana. You remember what His Excellency the President said? Every drop that the Russians drop, it impacts us in Ghana, even in our pocket. So imagine the people of Ukraine themselves who are being impacted directly by the Russian invasion. This morning, I'm fortunate to have in the studio Tatiana Peshonshi, if I got the pronunciation right. She's the head of the Human Rights Center, Zmina, joining me in the studio to talk about, the plight of, the people in Ukraine, giving us a sense of what the realities are, because all we read about is in the news, video images, but as to the real situation on the ground, she would paint that for us. Tatiana, it's good to have you in the studio.
Good morning. Thank you for
I'm hoping you're doing well.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so tell us, what's the situation in Ukraine now?
As human rights defenders working on the ground, we fix huge amount of war crimes and crimes against humanity happening in the course of the Russian armed aggression. And these are not just single casualties that could happen in every war, but we see that Russia deliberately is targeting civilians and committing the war crimes in mass. At the moment, Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine registered 38,000 of criminal proceedings based on the facts of war crimes, and this is not the final number, because every day they open plus 100, plus 200 new cases, because the war is on the active hot stage.
Now, you speak about war crimes. What forms do they take, these war crimes you speak of?
Yeah, they are different types of war crimes. These are the murders and extrajudicial killings of civilians, also deliberately targeting infrastructure, especially schools, kindergartens, residential areas by Russian rockets and kamikaze drones. But also these are cases of torture, of sexual violence, many cases of looting, and the gravest international crimes which we document and collect, so they will be investigated in future.
Interesting. Let's talk about the welfare of the people. We'll come to the war itself, but let's talk about the welfare of the people. The young men who have had to run, the women who are looking for shelter, the refugees in other countries. How is life in Ukraine?
It's very difficult because 1/3 of the population had to flee. Either they are displaced either inside the country or moved abroad. This is 13 million of Ukrainians, including my parents-in-law. Our house in Irpin near Kiev was partially destroyed by the Russian munition. So it affects every Ukrainian family, but especially women and children who suffer, among others, a lot from the consequences of this invasion.
Should we be here in the first place, casting our minds back to the commencement of this war and the warnings Russia had given? Should we be here? Should there have been a war in the first place? This
should be at the first place, because it is not only about Russia and Ukraine, and also I would like to remind that Ukraine is democracy, but Russia is authoritarian state, so it's also war of two systems of values. But it also has global implications and impact on the rest of the world. Here in Ghana, we met different interlocutors yesterday and the day before yesterday, including farmers, including businessmen, civil society organizations, and a lot of them, a lot of people here told us how prices have grown up, and also the inflation rate, which is very high here this year, expected to be very high in Ghana, fuel prices, energy prices, so everything is getting very expensive because of this war, because Russia started its aggression against Ukraine.
Now, there are those who would say that but for the initiations of Zelensky, President Zelensky, and the warnings from President Putin to hasten slowly, we would not be here. After all, prior to the invasion, Ukraine had been Ukraine, regardless of Russia's attempt to, try to, get some part of Ukraine. There had been that seeming peace there. So I ask again, should we be here in the first place?
You know, this war started not on 24th of February. It started in 2014 when Russia occupied the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea and started its war in Donbass. And before it, in 2013, Ukraine was a non-bloc country. We didn't plan to join NATO. And moreover, Ukraine was used to have a nuclear power, nuclear weapon, and Ukraine is voluntarily gave its nuclear weapon in 1994. Instead, Ukraine received guarantees of territorial integrity and sovereignty from three countries, basically from the USA, UK, and third guarantor was Russia. So basically, just in 20 years, one of the countries that guaranteed Ukraine territorial integrity attacked Ukraine and illegally annexed part of the Ukrainian territories. But when President Zelensky was elected, actually he tried to make some peace negotiations with Putin, and this was one of his slogans during his presidential campaign. But we see that in 2 years that didn't help to prevent another attack. So Russia is totally imperialistic state that want to colonize us, that want to restore the Russian Empire or new form of USSR. And Ukrainian people are not willing to follow this track, definitely not willing to follow.
So if Ukraine had shelved the whole idea of joining NATO, what would have happened?
Yeah, now the support for joining NATO in Ukraine is very big due to opinion polls. But this is just, as I said, in 2013, before Russia attacked Ukraine, it was not popular at all, and we hope that our not bloc status will help us, to live in a peace with all our neighbors. But now people see that it didn't help and didn't prevent the attack. So people want to seek at least some form of protection, which they think that NATO, if Ukraine joins the NATO, then we'll have, peace on a long term. But the NATO is not very much willing to, take us on board. So that is also true.
Now, let's talk about the geography and the culture. Between Ukrainians and Russians, on a normal day, what's the relationship?
Well, historically we are different Slavic people, like Polish people or Czech people, so these are different Slavic nations. Ukraine is 5 centuries older than Russia, and actually the Kievan Rus, big medieval kingdom, started from Kiev in Ukraine, and there was nothing on the place of Moscow, only forests. So now, all these decades, we lived in peace. But Russia is in a mind its empire, and they want to expand its territories by attacking the other neighboring countries. And one of the reasons why it's happening to us is also the impunity, because Russians were involved in the war not only in Ukraine, committing a lot of war crimes, but also in Syria, and also the Russian mercenaries were involved here in Africa, in Central African Republic, in Mali. They committed murder, rape, tortures, and no accountability for that. So they have their hands free, to attack and to commit this again and again. So for us, it's crucial there would be an accountability for what they did. Not only those perpetrators who committed war crimes on the ground, their commanders who gave them orders, but also top leadership of the Russian Federation, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Minister Shoigu, and others who are war criminals, who basically gave orders and commands to bombard Ukrainian cities without no military purpose, just to make a suffer and pain for civilians, to terrify people because they cannot, win on the military field.
Now, there are those who hold the view that the West failed Ukraine. If the armaments that have come, maybe the last 2 months, have come earlier, would not be here. Do you share that view?
Yeah, I share that view, and actually in the first days and weeks of this large-scale invasion, we were calling all our partners abroad, reaching the governments of the EU, USA, asking us to provide as soon as possible the military equipment to defend ourselves. But this support is coming, but coming slowly. So if we have this ammunition and equipment that we are receiving now, half a year ago, that would help to prevent much more casualties and to save more people's lives.
Now, are the people in Ukraine upbeat because we've been reading in the news about how Ukrainian soldiers are being able to reclaim some cities which had been annexed by Russia. Are they upbeat that in the end, those which have been annexed, they'll be able to reclaim them with the support that the U.S. is giving and the promises that President Biden has made in terms of supplying armaments for Ukraine?
Yeah, you know, for us, the only solution is restoring all territorial integrity of Ukraine, including occupied Crimea, controlled over Crimean Peninsula. And the simple reason why for us it's like a solution, because we saw that in 2014 Russia already annexed Crimea and Russia started its war in Donbass, but that didn't stop them moving forward. So even if one piece of Ukrainian territory remains under the control of the Russian troops, for us that means that they will maybe recalculate their mistake, they will use time to prevent another attack. And maybe even not on us, they could attack Moldova, they could attack Baltic states, other states. So Russia in its nature is aggressive country. And the only way for us of survival is to restore our territorial integrity, and also the strategy of the West is also to de-weaponize Russia, to put sanctions so Russian war machine cannot effectively pump up and cannot continue this war and new attacks.
Now, if you look at Russia's attempt at conscript and the protests as well within Russia today, how do you feel about the protests going on in Russia, though it's being resisted?
You know, these protests are very weak because in 20 years of Putin's presidency, he destroyed the civil society and free media in Russia. It's a global crackdown of human rights, and this internal oppression made possible external aggression. So there were some protests, but we see that they are not making any crucial change, and a lot of conscripted men are being sent to the battlefield without like any training. So they are, you know, quickly killed, and which is more terrible for me, that Russia is conscripting also Ukrainians from the occupied territories like Crimea or part of the Donbass to fight for Russia, which is a war crime, because occupying country cannot conscript the population of the occupied territory to its own army. But Russia is doing that, especially in Crimea. Russia is conscripting Crimean Tatars. These are indigenous people of Crimea, Crimean minority, Crimean natives that lived in Crimea many centuries before, you know, and also suffering from Russia. During the Stalin times, all people, Crimean Tatars, were deported to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to Central Asia. The whole nation was deported by Stalin. So they suffered a lot from Russians during their history, and then when they came back to Crimea in 90s, now they are experiencing another wave of oppression.
Now, the talk about war crimes. Do you think President Putin ever will face the justice system for these war crimes you speak of? Because if indeed, for instance, the world wanted to go, or the West wanted to go an all-out war, would have seen it by now. Would he ever face?
Yeah, he has to, if he's still alive by that moment. We know that now Ukrainian case is being investigated in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and they send the investigators who work on the ground and who document everything happening in Ukraine. And by the way, a week ago on Monday, it was a huge attack on Ukraine, on 20 Ukrainian cities with 84 Russian rockets and 24 kamikaze drones. And this was purely against civilian population, no military targets at all, which is clear war crime. And Putin in Russian television said that they reached out their goals. So basically, he admitted the responsibility for these huge mass war crimes. And the ICC investigators during this attack were hiding together with Ukrainians in bomb shelters. And Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, said that the ICC would investigate this crime, which for me has clear, you know, allegations of who is standing behind it. But the problem is that in the ICC it could take 5-10 years before, you know, before the trial. We don't know what happens with Putin by that. We don't know what happens with Russia. So now it's very important to support Ukrainian society and Ukrainian military, so we can win this war and we can release our territories.
Now, the people of Russia themselves, as to how President Putin wields so much power, do you as Ukrainians ever wonder how
Yeah,
there isn't any revolt by the people of Russia who are seemingly, from some of us who have not been there, we see them as fierce? Why haven't they revolted, or are they happy with Mr. Putin?
it looks like the vast majority is happy with Putin, but the more this war lasts, the more questions they start to ask. Because ordinary Russians now are being mobilized and conscripted to the army, and you know, almost every second Ukrainian family has relatives in Russia. Like my family too. Our relatives live in Moscow region, and you know, they support Putin. They support this bloody war. For us, we just stopped communicating with them because we were trying to explain what Russian army did in Irpin, in Bucha, where like my husband's parents live, but they said it's not true. We know better from our television what happened. They don't want to listen us who experience all these crimes. So I think it's a power of Russian propaganda, because they were so heavily brainwashed during the decades. And this is not only a propaganda, fake news, this is also about fueling a hate speech, hatred against Ukrainians. So they denied the very existence of the Ukrainian nation. They, even historically in the Russian Empire, they called us Malorossa, little Russians. So they want to Ukrainianize Ukraine, which is, you know, a clear sign of genocide. And that is the initial goal of Mr. Putin and the real reason of starting this war.
Your family is in Russia and they don't believe you. The issue of propaganda. The Russians have also accused Ukraine of propaganda. And so, between your side and the Russian side, who do we believe? Because the West seems to be on your side, propagating what is seemingly the atrocities of Russia, but the people of Russia are also being shown what is seemingly the atrocities of Ukraine to them. So who do we believe?
You know,
That thin
just
line.
to equate Russia and Ukraine and say that there are propaganda from both sides is just to equate the victim and aggressor. You know, women that is being raped and rapist, and say that, you know, women which is screaming is propaganda. And this is a very easy way how to make your own assessment. Just come to Ukraine. There are a huge amount of media who are working in Ukraine, who are traveling to this liberated area, who are telling the stories from the ground. The best way is just to come to Ukraine and see it with own eyes, or ask people who live there, like us who came from Kiev, to tell what is happening in Ukraine. I think it's very important to dismantle all that like fake narratives and to report in the objective way what is happening.
Now, we'll be ending our conversation shortly, but let's focus our attention, the last bit of the conversation, on the women and the children. Because I'm asking myself, I know recently there was that trade agreement for, you know, ships carrying cereals and other food to cross that strait. Russia agreed to it. Initially, there were some issues there, but I know finally they agreed. I'm looking at how women and children are coping. Food, shelter, transportation, basic amenities. How are they coping?
You know, this war is especially painful for women and children, and there are a lot of like a gender-based violence during this war. Like I mentioned, a lot of cases of sexual violence, not only against women but also against children. And this is largely hidden because usually the victims do not report the sexual abuse. It's very difficult for them. But we have several dozens of cases which are already investigated by the prosecutors of sexual violence, including 5 cases of rape of children, starting from 4 years age. And also 400 Ukrainian children were already killed, 800 children were wounded, 2,500 Ukrainian schools and kindergartens were damaged, and out of them 300 were destroyed. And in Ukraine, those children who go to school, usually they also need to go to bomb shelters when there is an air alarm. And this is not only about some, you know, crimes committed in a physical way against children and women, but also a huge psychological impact. that we will feel on the level of generation for these children which are traumatized by the effects of this war.
Now, what sort of support are they receiving?
We receive the most important support that we receive as a country is first of all financial support, because our economy in this year dropped by 1/3, but we need funds, money to pay salaries for teachers, for doctors, to pay pensions. So very important financial support. Second is a military support, because we need to liberate our territories. And the third, which is very important, is sanctions, because this undermines the Russian war machine and prevents it from, escalating and aggravating the situation and preparing new attacks on Ukraine.
But the issue of sanctions, someone would say if it would have worked, by now the Russian machinery should be down. But Russia is receiving support. Recently, I was reading the story of Belarus. Russia constantly is trading. Russia constantly is getting armaments. You know, the push of the Chinese and the North. These are all countries that are positioning themselves also to take advantage of the situation, also to showcase their own issues with the nations that Russia is supposedly fighting. Not necessarily Ukraine, United States of America, the UK, and the rest of them. So there's still support. Will these sanctions in any way yield any results?
Yeah, Russia is challenging the trade change and all the rules of trade which were established after the Second World War. And Russia is using its energy supply as a method of blackmailing others, as you mentioned, not only Ukraine but also other countries. Russia wants to freeze us in the winter, attacking our electric power plants and the chains of electricity supply. So it's a clear, Russia was recognized a terrorist state by the Council of Europe, by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and another resolution about recognizing Russia a terroristic state will be voted by the European Parliament. We hope that also it will be done on the level of the EU, and we see that sanctions are having impact on the Russian economy. It will also drop by the end of this year from 5 to 10% minus in terms of GDP. So it's a huge impact on Russian economy, but the longer time we have, the more devastating it will be for the Russian Federation.
It's interesting, but even in all this, the citizens of Russia still support, majority of them still support Vladimir Putin. Now, the intent, the ultimate goal for the sanctions is virtually to render the economy crippled. And it is then that the people, the citizens themselves, are going to feel the pinch as the heat, the unbearable heat they have to deal with. Then they will start speaking against the government as to the essence of the war. But if with all these sanctions that are still in place, the people are still in support of their president, then something might be missing out there.
Actually, the level of support of Putin is dropping from the end of summer, and with this mobilization, conscription to the Russian army, the drop is even bigger. So I think it will have an effect on the long term, and Russians also will suffer in economic terms from these sanctions, and that means that also on a long-term perspective, less and less people will support Putin.
But this long-term that you speak of, has Ukraine got that time for that long-term scene? Now it's personal.
Yeah.
It's drones against civilians. Do you have that time for that long-term goal?
For us, it's also very difficult and tough, because we have the hole in our budget, $5 billion US dollars every month, and we need somehow to find this money and to refill it. So basically, we are receiving the financial support and either loans or grants from international financial institutions and from foreign countries. But yes, you're right. For us, it's very tough. But for us, it's a matter of the very existence of the Ukrainian state. So we will do everything possible to survive and to get through this war.
I'll give you two last questions. One has to do with the end in sight for the war. Is there an end in sight for this war?
The end is very simple. The end is when Russia withdraws its troops from the territory of Ukraine, from its internationally recognized borders.
Do you think this is going to escalate into a nuclear matter? Because that's what the world is afraid of.
Yeah.
That's what the West is afraid of, that this would become a matter of a nuclear war. And if you gauge the posture of the Russians, that's where they want the world to go.
Yeah.
Is that where we are headed towards?
That is would be very terrible situation, not only for us, and especially having also Chernobyl in our territory. I was born in the Chernobyl polluted area, so I know how devastating are the results of such situation. And now it looks like Russia is more threatening because they also know that response from the West will be very painful. Their army can be destroyed totally, and this war then will be really not between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and the rest of the like the world democratic countries. So Russia now occupied the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest in the Europe, and this is the first time in the history when the nuclear power plant is being occupied. And Russia is threatening also with some explosions, and so one of our here the goals is also to gain more international support to convince Russia to withdraw its troops from the territory of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and to demilitarize the zone in the vicinity of this nuclear power plant.
Is it too late for a diplomatic solution to this problem? Is it too late for a diplomatic solution to this problem?
As President Zelensky said, we are ready for diplomatic solution, but with the next president of the Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin already committed so huge number of the gravest crime. He is basically a war criminal and a terrorist. He converted Russia in a terroristic state, and this is very difficult to negotiate with terrorists.
I thank you, Tatiana, for joining me this morning. Your Ukrainian folks are listening. Your Russian family members are also listening and watching, because I know definitely the embassy is here, and so they would follow the conversation. What would be your final words to anybody who might be watching today?
Yes, I just wanted to say that we as Ukrainians, we need to stop this war, and we need a justice, and impunity is a key issue why Russia is continuing these aggressive attacks. So we really need to bring them to justice, to The Hague, and then we'll receive a sustainable peace.
I'm grateful you joined me this morning, Tatiana.